First off, I would like to remind whoever is reading this that all of these stories are 100% true and have happened to me personally, so there's no lying here. Also, I don't know why, but I feel almost compelled to tell my experiences, and I hope someone can relate to them or get a kick out of them. I have had run-ins with Skinwalkers on 3 separate occasions. Let me tell you, they are not easy to talk about, let alone write about, because just thinking about it gets me scared again. So I will tell you about the first time I ever saw one, which happened to be the first time I even heard of one. First off, a little background about me. I live in Utah, and all of the experiences happened to me while I was living at home with my parents. I grew up about an hour outside of Salt Lake City in farming country, so I was raised on a farm. Growing up, I used to go hunting with my dad and brothers 4 times a year. Between hunting, camping, and growing up on a farm, I know my animals. Now, to start the story, it was 7 years ago in late October. I was 18 years old, and my boyfriend, now husband, was 21. For the sake of being private, we're going to call him Rob. Rob is half Spanish, half Irish. And one thing to note, Rob is a pretty big boy, 6 feet tall, 260 pounds, football star. He lived all the way in Salt Lake, but he would still drive up every day after we both got off work to see me. He was a trooper. Well, one night he wasn't feeling too good, so we decided to take off a little earlier than 3 a.m. We walked out my back door to the front of the house where his car was parked. The moment we walked out the back door, the smell consumed us. It smelled like rotten meat. Rob commented that the country air stunk more than usual. I remember thinking that maybe a cow had died earlier that day and we didn't know, but it smelled like it had been decomposing for weeks. When we got to his car, Rob threw his stuff in quick and got back out to give me one last hug goodbye. When something caught my eye. It looked like a skinny, bony dog that could barely walk. I remember maybe thinking it was a stray and I was gonna shoo it away. But the way the body was shaped made me think that it was some sort of coyote. So I kept quiet. It was sniffing around in my neighbor's front yard. Then all of a sudden it stopped dead in its tracks. And it stared directly at my boyfriend and I. Now this stare made the hair on my neck and arms stick straight up. It was like it wasn't just looking at me, but studying me almost. When all of a sudden, it stood up on 2 legs and hauled ass into the fields behind my neighbor's house. When it stood, it was very tall and gangly, but it stood so damn smoothly. And when it started to run, you'd think it was Usain Bolt. It was so fast, but oddly enough, I never heard its feet hit the ground. I grabbed onto Rob, scared out of my damn mind. I turned to him, but he was still watching it run away in horror. I whispered to him, "What the fuck was that?" His face went pale, and he replied to me, "Hurry and get your ass inside your house. Lock the doors, shut your blinds, turn your lights off, and call me." No questions asked. I started to sprint into the backyard to the door, and when I got inside, I did as he said. I got into my bedroom, which is in the front of the house, top floor. I peeked out of my window, and Rob's car was already out of sight, so he must have burned some major rubber getting out of sight so quickly. I have never dialed his number fast enough. He was asking me if everything was okay, and making sure I was fine and that I did everything he said. I again asked him what we had just seen. He told me he didn't want me freaking out, but eventually he gave up and explained to me what it was. It was a Skinwalker. He continued to tell me that he knew because he had seen one before and was well informed on what they were because his Navajo friend was there the night that he saw one for the first time. His friend took Rob back to his house, and his grandmother explained to Rob the Navajo stories behind them, what they were, and she also cautioned them both not to go near them, don't think about them, don't talk about them, etc. Needless to say, we were both scared out of our minds, and we started hanging out in the city in his house, rather than where I lived because it was such a bad experience. 7 years later, we are married now and living in the city. We don't talk about what happened that night unless it has to be talked about. And when we do, we both get pretty frightened. I will post later about my other encounters. Maybe I'll convince my husband to let me put his story on there. What do you guys think? Skinwalker? Man, bear, pig? My grandfather once told me a story as we sat down around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in the purple sky, with a full, fat moon hanging low over the mountains. This voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide, dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, he began, I lived out in the Apache reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and was set out raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between the brambly mountainside with dirt good for growing thorn bush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some abandoned farmsteads. The fire sparked, and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. What next? I asked. Settle down, boy, you'll hear soon enough. Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember, too, when the engine began to sputter, the truck slowed to a jerky stop. God damn it, Pa said, guiding the Ford onto the side of the road as it coasted to a halt. Stay here, son. As he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop in the heat and lay there until crows pecked enough holes into their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing and hung still and heavy, with the stink filling the cab. Pa, I called. Pa, Pa. No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me. My bones, in my chest. Boy, I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam, not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over to my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road, through the dim beam of the headlights, across the partly opened domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit off to the side, and he looked pensively into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweating and clammy. Well, what happened? What about your father? What did you see? He sighed. A creature. He shook his head. You have to understand, there were legends, old legends, older than the rocks carved out in the valley, older than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and the old Indian chiefs and their shamans. The Apaches, the Hopi, and the Cherokee, and all of them old tribes and the first peoples, they told tales, told stories about dark Indian magic, and a deal made with old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards, and later the white men that came for their land and women. They called them. He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and bodied forward into his tale. Across the fire in the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and old mountains, he bodied forward. They called them Skinwalkers, shape changers, old warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote. But messed up, boy, long and malformed snouts, teeth like a Bowie knife, long arms, and standing 7 foot, even hunched over. They'd gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'd run through the bullets and sabers, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. Wily, too, they could change their voice to match any person you knew or might know. Boy, that's what I saw. Big and fast. Only for a second, it ran across the road, gray and mottled. Muscle flexing under its legs, hooves clomping on the road, stringy, muscled, hunched shoulders. And it turned. Looked right into the cab. Looked right into my eyes. And I swear, boy, I swear it grinned at me. I sank into my seat. In shock. In fear. Shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens, charged and full with power. I yelled for my pa, but no words came out. Just a dry squeak. I was shaking as my grandfather told this story. He was still here, so I know he lived. But the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of Skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, it could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legends say. Maybe an hour before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime. 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, pulling my fists up to fend off attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of a man in Poland when he freed all them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run for it, or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma." As he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out onto the road, and our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. "But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom?" "No, boy. I knew because out of the window, out of the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and I saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us, boy." My pa kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward. "Son," he said, "don't look at it. Don't look at it." That's how I knew, boy. Thank you so much for watching my channel and listening to my narrations. I want to give a special thanks to the people who have created these stories. I'll be posting 2 videos every single week, so like and subscribe. This is Sinister Grave.